Once again, good afternoon. Our second session is devoted to the issues of natural monopolies and competition on the regulated markets. I remember yesterday there were many questions about energy, transportation market. I hope today our speakers will be able to answer those questions. So what are the major questions concerning the regulated markets? First of all, two issues. First, is that really a natural monopoly and is there any potential for competition? And the second matter is, again, talking about regulated markets, what should be the contribution by the regulator or any competing authorities. First, we have here the head of National Commission for Energy Regulation. The floor is yours. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to see you all here. I'd like to remind you about when our commission was established and when it became fully legitimate. It was established yet in 2000 it was one of the first commission of this type in Europe, although the United States had similar authorities. Yet in 19th century the initial goal was to regulate the market of natural gas and electric power. Then the commission changed its functions a number of times. There was a separate commission to regulate the utility market, and then the United Commission was established to regulate both the utility market, centralized heat supply, centralized water supply, sewage, and electric power supply. Then 16 years after the registration of the first law, the law on this National Commission was adopted. We need to understand that that's one of the basic laws guiding the activities of the Commission, but we need to keep in this puzzle other laws like law on the natural gas market, law on power supply market, which are the key laws for the activities of the Commission too. Today we have the natural gas market, and through the prism of this market we can see which functions the national regulator has retained. They are reduced functions comparing to previous functions because the Commission used to regulate the whole market, including pricing, regulation, etc. After now we deal just with natural monopolies, while the gas extraction market has become liberal and is not subject to any regulation except by the government through special obligations. So we deal just with natural monopolies, which is natural gas transportation and distribution. The English terms mostly use are transmission and distribution. The similar ideas and the basis of the electric power supply market, where the Commission will retain just the powers to regulate natural monopolies related to transmission and distribution too. If we move to these segments in details, we'll see that the key priority for the Commission is preparation and transition to the incentive pricing. We all know that from the moment of the establishment of the markets and Commission, the regulation method was cost plus, which is already obsolete and does not create any incentives for any players at this market because they do not have motivation to be efficient. They do not have incentives to invest or to improve the quality for the consumers. So many countries used to have this kind of frustration when the cost plus had been used for a long time, but nothing better had ever been found. So in 1989, in the 90s, United Kingdom invented the concept in view of tier and wear of the networks, supply networks, they thought about making it more convenient for the consumers by finding a way to improve the networks and actually making it more convenient for the consumer. So they defined the cost of the assets used in the regulated activities, then equal treatment for all players was ensured, which is the established margin, profitability margin, and also the performance indicators were established, in particular reduction of operational cost, a reduction of the power losses, and if you compare it with the cost plus system, then the expenditures of enterprises are certainly over controlled, and the regulator can dictate what the company should do. In this case, the company has different ways to ensure the established performance indicators, and all the savings are retained by the company. This system will not create any good advantages within a year, but in essence this is the right idea, because this business that requires significant capital investments in order to change anything. So take an example of the United Kingdom, and now in Europe almost all of the countries moved towards incentive pricing and distribution of power supply, transmission of power, electric power, gas transmission, and all. Actually this methodology has proven to be very efficient. So actually comparing to cost plus system, we can clearly see the improvement of the quality for the consumers. Now our Commission has prepared almost full set of regulations in order to ensure such transition. We need to understand that all countries during such transition had to agree on certain compromises in the regulation point and in the political environment, because initially the tariffs that we had were not compensating in full the operators' cost, so we'll have to go through quite a difficult path. But I expect that there were some decisions already embedded into some political decisions like coalition agreements, and it was agreed that some sectors would be regulated through this incentive pricing. That also will help the companies understand what is the right way to do this business. Plus, that offers some more positive consequences for privatization, but that probably is a separate topic for another conference concerning the successful privatization in Ukraine. I personally will not be happy with distribution privatization if it is implemented without this incentive pricing approach. I think all key donors, international organizations share my opinion, and they support our Commission in such a decision without any political compromises, but on the basis of the proper long-term prospects for the regulator. That was about the electric power supply. Talking about the gas supply, we have several plans, while in power supply there is a notion of title to the assets. As in the natural gas sector, it's a problem about the title. I mean, who should this incentive pricing apply to? I hope that when the issues of ownership title have been regulated. The Commission will be able to move towards incentive pricing. Talking about centralized water supply, we are engaged in similar effort. We are preparing methodology of evaluation of such assets. We are preparing for establishing the performance indicators for different periods of regulations, and we are preparing pilot projects already this year. We do this job, work together with USAID, and as soon as the respective regulations on state property fund is amended, we will be ready to start these changes. I would say that will be kind of a revolution in the regulation of natural monopolies, because the tariffs will finally allow the operators to plan their activities, not just to cover their operational cost, but also to ensure for all consumers the sustainable, good quality services. That's briefly all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as a rule, we defer questions until the end of the session, but since Mr. Wolk is about to leave, we'll make an exception to this rule. Bogdan Chotes, could I refer to one of the questions asked yesterday? Ms. Lapin yesterday said that there were some issues with the decision made by your committee. Apart from Article 23 of the special legislation, there is nothing there about complaining, appealing your decisions. And second, you mentioned incentive pricing. Is that in any way reflected in the draft resolution which is posted on your website? Centralized heating, hot water supply. Thank you. Thank you. Regarding appeals, you can do that before the law is passed or after. But that's outside of your today's agenda, I understand. As regards incentive pricing, we have to differentiate between documents that set forth the methodology and documents that establish tariffs for specific industries or enterprises. At this moment, the methodology is being finalized. There are some state property funds draft documents on evaluation method or assessment methodology. As soon as the companies have completed their assessment and address the Commission, will be ready to go on with the incentive pricing. May I remind you that as of September 2015, all our meetings were streamed live, and 3 days before each meeting, we post draft resolutions with the reasoning part on our website. It was a challenge back then, but now we do that regularly. Our own key decisions are also supported by some visuals, infographics, etc., so that you could see the issues, the advantages. So now I understand tariffs are approved by the resolution of your committee dating back to 2015, and it was based on the methodology approved in 2011. And it used the cost plus, so to speak, method. Will this new resolution be once again based on cost plus or not? And Mr. Pittman, you could probably comment. What's середняк на
cost. Це суть природи.
So that's the essence of natural monopolies. Basically, they have unlimited horizon to write off their fixed costs. So this cost plus methodology could be seen as something restricting the development of natural monopolies. I don't want to answer my own question, so how can you comment? Well, look, it's cost plus today, and it's everyone's knowledge. Once we are ready for incentive pricing, we will launch it in all sectors that we mentioned. This year, they expect the reform of heat distribution. So, will you support the unbundling? Well, the Commission will support that measure. That said, however, we should also be aware of the fact that where we have high concentration of consumers and there are some generation sources, it might be expedient to utilize them to the end instead of fostering, so to speak, wild competition that might also lead to increased generation costs. Probably local government should be given broader powers, and the Commission is initiating innovation of pricing so that heat distribution, that the local government have wider discretion to set the tariffs. And I'm sure that in some cases where local government assumes full responsibility and they can come up with a perfect heat supply system and see whether unbundling is beneficial or detrimental, so to speak. Alexander Zavada. Incentive pricing for sustainable sectoral development. Does that imply that since insurance is part of risk management and prevention and also supports sustainable development, so does it imply that voluntary insurance will also become a reality, because the current cost plus excludes this possibility? Well, the logic of incentive pricing provides that as a fair price, you have average weighted capital cost applied, including all the risks borne by the company. So they can then see whether they want to assume that risk in full or minimize it by insurance. At any rate, when incentive prices is in place, they'll have greater room for maneuver, and of course, thank you, Dmytro. We too hope that through our cooperation, competition in the energy market will flourish. Instead of goodbyes, let me say that we are looking forward to the emergence of the transportation regulator in California. The regulator regulates telecom, transport, and energy. Once again, thank you. Our next speaker is Nadezhda Koznacheva, Deputy Minister of the Infrastructure of Ukraine. So she'll probably tell us some more about the new regulator. Before we merge with the electricity regulator, we have to set up a regulator for transport services. Unlike energy sector, we can't boast of having set such a regulator up. In accordance, however, with the law on natural monopolies and the government action plan approved by the Cabinet of Ministers, such a transportation regulator is to be established. Furthermore, last May, the Ministry of Infrastructure drafted and sent a law to the Parliament, which was returned for some refining, but we do hope that sometime in September we may have that commission in place. After all, many problems inherent in energy are as inherent in transportation. The infrastructure hasn't been reformed for 25 years. So the transportation regulator is something which is in high demand. The ministry or the central executive authority shaping transportation policy is developing tariff methodology, regulate rail tariffs, air and maritime. We would really want to act as our friends from the energy sector do, and the Commission will function transparently, openly, publicly when regulating tariffs for transportation. Another function that will be vested in the Commission under the law I mentioned is to provide, develop incentives. Whether we like it or not, the transportation infrastructure is part and parcel of economy, and we have to develop it. The third function we see in law is promotion of competition. Well, there's another function it's ongoing monitoring of the market, something that we don't have in the ministry. We have to be able to monitor and compare with best practices. Why it's important? Well, for instance, now we are in the process of revising a new methodology of port fees. It's already obsolete, the one we are using now. Our ports do not compete against each other. They compete against Constanța, Rotterdam port. So if we are able to monitor the trends globally, we can timely apply them here. I understand that I should be brief because there are other speakers on the panel. As far as the rail is concerned, we understand the reform is overdue. Private businesses have access to freight cars, not the locomotives, and tariffs are again regulated manually, as it were. We hope that the finalized draft law will end up in the Parliament already this year, and the Parliament will concur with us, approve the law, and will be able to do that aforementioned merger with the energy regulator. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Jose Manuel Hernandez, First Secretary, EU Delegation to Ukraine, and will once again talk about regulation, competition regulation of the energy sector in the European Union.
Translation, it takes a bit of time. First of all, actually, I want to thank on behalf of DG Competition and the EU delegation the invitation to be here. I follow actually in the EU delegation energy markets and competition policy. Before joining the delegation, I was working in DG Competition, both in the energy antitrust unit and the state aid energy unit. I want to actually talk about competition and regulation, just using actually a case study, which is how actually is the approach in the EU energy sector. I think also it's quite relevant for Ukraine because the law on the electricity market actually is still being discussed, and in principle Ukraine is actually bound to try to have the same model as we have for both EU energy sector regulation and the competition framework in the EU. So the lessons that actually we are going to find here, they should be applicable as well in Ukraine. I will try to show three things. The first is to which extent competition law enforcement has helped to shape regulation in the EU. The second thing actually is how actually competition law enforcement has helped to improve the level playing field that regulation sometimes has not managed to do so. And the third bit I want to show as well is, thanks to state control, how actually public funding has been able to actually be optimized, so to speak. Here actually the first slide is showing a bit of a comparative analysis of the three instruments, which I'm going to go over here. The first is the regulatory bit, the second is antitrust enforcement, and the third is state control. When we look into antitrust, that's actually an animal which is always an ex post tool, while both state aid control and regulation, they are both ex ante. Both antitrust and state aid control, it is all about enforcing individual cases, while when it comes to regulation, it is measures towards everyone. Something significant from antitrust law enforcement is that it can actually have changes both in the behavior of companies as well on the actual structure of the sector. A very simplified version of the electricity supply chain in the EU, applicable as well in many other jurisdictions when there is liberalization, and hopefully very soon as well in Ukraine. So what we do have, if we actually look at the four tranches, that is showing a little bit actually first the physical flows of energy. So we would have generation and consumers on the end-hand side, which are open to competition. And in the middle side, we have the networks, transmission and distribution, that, as the chairman of the energy regulator explained, is subject to price regulation. When it comes to the markets, we have two main markets. We have this wholesale market with generators and suppliers interacting, and we have the retail market where we actually have suppliers and consumers interacting. This slide is just trying to put a few words into the scheme that I showed before. The very first three actually are pretty well known for anyone that actually is working in the energy sector, which is based on the unbundling of networks and activities based on competition. We have regulated third party and access to the networks. And the last bit is independent regulatory oversight. Something that sometimes is a bit less known when it comes to what we call the third package is the network codes, which are actually extremely detailed regulatory instruments to manage the interface between the different national markets. The last bit, which is worth mentioning, is that in the end of last year, December 2016, there was a very comprehensive package of new proposals to try to address a number of problems. One of the most relevant one was in the field of the wholesale energy market. It's called here an upgrade, and it is just trying to solve the problem that is being seen in terms of lacking, for instance, flexibility of generation or the incoming and more popular capacity mechanisms. In this slide, I'm showing a representative sample of the main antitrust cases by the European Commission in the last 9 years. So therefore, they have actually been taking place both in the second and in the third package. I will try to show a bit the issues that we had, as well as the effect that some of these cases had in the market. The first one was actually a case of market manipulation, where a power generator in Germany was actually be found, allegedly, to be withdrawing capacity. So they were actually just not offering all the power they could with their power plants, and therefore that was pushing prices up. The result of this antitrust case, there was actually an agreement on commitments, and it actually led to the divestment of some power plants of this generator, and therefore, as a result, less dominance in that market. A bit of a spin-over as well, we actually had later on regulation passed called REMIT to actually oversee in a more systematic way market manipulation in the both electricity and gas markets. So here we have a bit of the influence on what it had on the regulatory framework. The next four in the list, they're actually all cases involving the regulated sector. So what we can see here is that antitrust certainly is not deterred by having a regulatory framework, and even companies that comply with the regulatory framework, they are not just simply excluded or safe from antitrust investigations. They were all related to vertical foreclosure, either because they were actually being prevented from accessing the grid, or there was hoarding of capacity. In some of these cases, it led to the actual ownership and bundling of the network business from the upstream and downstream business. The last two I want to mention from this slide is one very relevant from the Swedish transmission system operator, where it was actually found, again, another regulated activity. It was found to be actually curtailing capacity, export capacity from Sweden to Denmark. The result of this antitrust case, actually, it led to a whole reconfiguration of the wholesale market in Sweden and split up into several bidding zones. And the transmission system operator also committed to invest in new networks. Again, something that actually, from a regulatory point of view, would have been quite difficult to achieve. The very last one, actually, and one of the most recent one, it was BEG Electricity. And in this particular case, in the contracts that BEG and subsidiaries were actually writing down with wholesale operators, it was actually found territorial or destination clauses, therefore preventing actually from the re-export of electricity. And the result from this case actually was the establishment as a remedy of a power exchange in Bulgaria. So I think that here, the main message is that actually antitrust enforcement can have a significant impact, very often much bigger than actually regulation. A few words on state aid. I also love this topic. I decided actually not to be in the previous topic because DG COMP has always been the state aid panel. So we thought we had to give a broader view actually that we do something more than state aid. But it is certainly a very important one as well in the energy sector. The first 3 actually, my colleagues from Comdex presented this before in Ukraine. It just explains what actually the modernization objectives were. First is, let's go away from bad aid and focus on good aid. The other one was actually to try to reduce the workload of cases that COM was receiving, so we can actually focus on much larger but fewer cases. And the third one was actually to make faster decisions. But important for energy was the overhaul that took place in 2014 with the new guidelines. And here I will only want to just highlight 2 things as well, pretty crucial for Ukraine in the development of the new law, which is in the field of capacity mechanisms as well as renewable energies. So we look here at renewable energy support. We all know the targets. We all know that the regulatory framework normally encourages or tries to make easy actually administrative procedures, but it is actually stated control, the one that through the approval or denial of support schemes has actually fueled to a very large extent the increase of renewables in the power sector in the EU. In 2014 to 2016, we actually had to run an impact assessment of these support schemes across the EU. We found that most schemes actually, they were administratively established by governments, very often overcompensating, and very often unable to actually try to introduce any corrective measures. The second thing is that this electricity was also actually sold or just given to a transmission system operator to later on put it into the market. Actually, the consequence that it had is that by having that sort of differentiation in the way a market player behaved, it led to actually huge distortions in wholesale markets as renewables kept increasing. The result was that to prevent overcompensation, there would actually be competitive bidding for the aid. So a member state would actually say how much renewables do I want, and then bidders would be actually setting the price, but no longer administrative setting of tariffs. And the other 2 key components were actually for having to sell actual electricity to the market instead of through an intermediary, the TSO, and introducing balancing responsibilities. The last bit in my presentation is about capacity mechanisms, because it's something which is being discussed as well in the context of the electricity law, and the actually rules for stated control in this particular turf. Rules were introduced in 2014, and a sector inquiry was launched in April 2015. And after 1 year and a half, we actually now have the results of the sector inquiry. It covered 11 member states. The UK was excluded at the time because it was the only country where the stated control system or stated control measure had actually been approved and checked. And a few surprising findings. The first is the amazing variety of capacity mechanisms across the EU. You had some which are market-wide, which in layman terms, it means that everyone receives a payment. So when actually a member state thinks that there is a problem to keep my lights on, I would pay everyone. Others, they were targeted, identifying that only certain plants may actually be eligible for this support. And under that, they could be volume-based or price-based. But more striking is that in the 11 member states which were actually analyzed, there were 35 measures, which means in average at least 3 per member state, which actually question a little bit to which extent it had been properly assessed if there is a problem in the first place, even before thinking about introducing any new measure. The sector inquiry had two important outputs. The first output was when it comes to the policy implications and recommendations for the regulatory framework from December 2016. And this was actually the flowchart which was actually recommended. First is you actually need to try to establish the need. You actually need to have a mechanism that studies over the mid and long term your generation adequacy needs. The second component is that you actually, if you are conducting market reform, first do that before you actually introduce a mechanism, because it is otherwise a bit difficult to understand if you have a problem or not. If you do actually establish that you have a problem, you need to try to see if this is a long-term or a short-term, because that will actually have quite an influence on the design of your measure. The third is the proportionality. We had quite an extensive presentation from Oxira looking into how to ensure that. Well, here, the solution is actually quite straightforward. It is do not try to establish it administratively, like capacity payments, but actually, again, enter into a competitive bidding process to actually establish the price. And the very last bit is that introducing a capacity mechanism, it adds a different price component, a different revenue stream from producers. In addition to getting paid for energy, they get paid for capacity. So when you have an internal market, it is very distortive when you actually introduce a new element, because it's going to distort the price on the other element, which is the main one. So in the EU, you could see fluctuations of prices as a result of a new capacity mechanism. So here is, at the very least, it should be open to all technologies. And the second element is that you should not actually exclude any foreign players from offering that product if they actually have it. Here is the enforcement record so far. So it's been 9 decisions in this particular field. And here what I cannot comment is, of course, the sector inquiry also looked into what can we do next. So it will be followed as well from other state aid investigations. And this is the wrapping up slide. So here is to which extent this is applicable to Ukraine. The sort of main message, again, same regulatory scheme, same competition law framework over the midterm. So a lot of these lessons actually are perfectly applicable. The wealth of case practice and jurisprudence is extremely broad. So you can actually benefit from a lot of this. 2 important components which were set by stone by the Court of Justice, which is antitrust law is independent from regulation, and certainly compliance with regulation does not hinder that you can go after those that infringe antitrust rules. Also quite important to see that antitrust remedies can be far more reaching and have a much sort of long-lasting effect as well in the structure of the market than regulation can. And on the bit of state aid, it's been quite commented already, but certainly quite a challenge to try to move from the heavily subsidized structure that you have today into the path of trying to meet state aid rules. But certainly there is a lot of incentives to do so. We were presented today actually the amazing projection for reducing public spending from maybe 7-9% all the way down to 2%. So at least certainly there is quite a good result if you achieve that. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation and this suggestion to Ukraine and competition authority as well. And now we're moving again from energy market to more infrastructure market. And our next speaker, Brian Tapner, U.S. Federal Commission. And Brian will talk about competition in regulated industries. Why to regulate, the scope and nature of regulation.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on the panel today. I have to start with the disclaimer that all U.S. government folks have to give, which is that the remarks that I'm about to give are those of me and me alone, and not those of the FTC or of any individual commissioner. Thank you. I feel like I nailed that one. I do have maybe a slightly different perspective to bring to these questions. My work is focused on competition investigations, often in regulated industries. I deal a lot in the oil and natural gas industries, and very often we deal with regulations that have some bearing on competition. I don't have, that's maybe a slightly different set of questions, but definitely a different set of questions than some of the very important questions about, say, what's an appropriate tariff design and what are the competitive implications of various ways of creating tariffs and regulations and rate regulations and that sort of thing. So I'm going to focus more on, frankly, the things that I know a little bit better, which has to do with competition in some of the regulated industries that I've come across. I just had, I know time is going to be a little bit short, so I'm going to have basically sort of 3 main points that I'm going to try to get to. First, to talk just a little bit about natural monopolies and sort of the historical rationale for imposing regulations in a given sector. Then I'll kind of move a little bit into the nature of regulation and the advocacy role that competition authorities can play. And then finally, we'll get into the intersection of competition law and regulation. And there's a recent case that I worked on that I think is a hopefully pretty nice example of some of that. So we can just start with, I mean, if we just go to the basics here, we can start with the broad agreement about what the things that competition brings that we all like. It's the things that we've heard a lot over the past day and a half, which is that, you know, market competition brings lower prices to consumers, higher quality of goods, better service, greater innovation, improved efficiency, greater variety to meet customer needs, all these really good things. But we know that there are times where market structures just don't work properly. And historically, the idea of regulation has often been tied to this idea of natural monopolies. The economists in the room, including Russ, will want to throw things at me if I try to explain as a layman exactly what a natural monopoly is, but if I get it wrong, please chime in. But the basic idea is that the market structure is such that the least cost way of providing the good or service involves one firm. So that if you had multiple firms competing in the market, you would end up with higher costs, higher prices, inefficient outcomes. That's the basic gist from the layman's point of view. Those sort of markets are historically the ones that have been targets for regulation, with the idea that in exchange for regulations that curb sort of the abuses, the potential abuses of that monopoly power, of that market power, the regulator will allow the firm to charge a price that, on some level, ought to approximate a competitive rate of return. Obviously, there's a lot of dispute about what that means. I think we're all familiar with the most frequently cited examples of these kind of industries, water supply, natural gas distribution, that sort of thing. Often these are characterized by high fixed costs, although maybe not necessarily that might not necessarily be the only kind of case that you want to deal with it. But of course, when you raise the question of the existence of a natural monopoly, the comeback is always, well, how natural is it really? You will find close questioning over the scope of what the natural monopoly really is. And so I think historically, if you look at something like electricity, at times that's a sector that has introduced competition at various levels over the years and sort of moved to sort of more focused definition of what natural monopoly can be. There's also some ideas out there about sort of competing for the space and the contestability of the natural monopoly, and that kind of introduces some arguments about the role of competition in those sectors. More broadly, I think it's probably important to bear in mind that when we think of the role of competition and regulation, we're not just going to be dealing with natural monopolies. We've got regulations that happen all the time. And in fact, most of the government regulation that's out there really has little or no bearing on competition at all. And here I'm thinking of sort of even-handed kinds of regulations that apply to job safety or consumer product safety or employment discrimination regulation, those kinds of things. Really don't have much effect on competition, but we know that there are certain types of regulations that, of course, do have this effect. And the main categories that we come across would be regulations that affect price directly, some sort of price control, price limit, that sort of thing. Regulations that impose some entry restrictions. This can be anything from either entry restrictions or rules that protect incumbents from outside competition. Classic kind of example here would be sort of professional qualifications, for instance. The ability to practice a certain profession may have some restrictions on it that serve to insulate the current providers from outside competition. And then there are, on occasion, I think there are some rules that authorize or sort of allow conduct that otherwise we would think would be competitively problematic. If you have there's some co-op, export co-op kinds of examples that are, we don't come across too much, but I think that they're out there, at least in the US experience. There's an important role here for the competition authority to play. As these regulations are overbroad, it's our task is to advocate for the carve back of those regulations when it's appropriate to do so. There's an acknowledgement that frequently the regulations that are in place are imposed at the behest of the industry itself, and in order to protect themselves from outside competition. And you can think maybe about the taxi commissions and the restrictions on ride-sharing services like Uber that have some impact on competition and have tried to insulate taxi drivers from a new service. Our role as advocates here. We have a lot of different tools at our disposal, but our fundamental role, as we heard yesterday, is really to urge the adoption of the least restrictive regulation needed to treat a specific problem. We can also, as competition advocates, urge regulators to consider whether there are any unintended consequences that might arise from the regulation, whether I think very importantly, whether the regulation will have any bearing on innovation and the development of new products or services. A lot of times as the competition authority, we have the expertise to lend to those kinds of questions and bring to it a view from what makes sense from competition standpoint, from a competition economics standpoint, that very often regulators simply don't have that capacity to do. So we have a slightly different perspective on how that can work. We have a lot of different tools at our disposal, including getting involved in actual regulatory proceedings and filing comments. We can challenge regulations through the courts. We can do a lot of informal work too, in terms of speeches and workshops and outreach and all that kind of stuff that we've heard about, and all of which can sort of help urge the adoption of sensible regulations or the carving back of regulations that are too broad. So one sort of maybe broader example of what can happen when a sector is regulated and goes through a process of deregulation happened in our railroads. I think it's just sort of worth mentioning, given the Ukraine experience. I think this is maybe a good example of an instance where regulations were started off quite broad and were carved back with I think pretty positive results. I'll just talk about it really briefly. Historically, the railroads in the U.S. are all privately owned, but there was an industry, a sector regulator that was given very broad regulatory powers over the railroads, including the authority to regulate price and certain controls over entry and exit and acquisitions and on and on. Over time, it kind of led to a very stagnant industry, one that didn't see much by way of price competition for sure and innovation as well. And in the late 1970s, we went through a period of deregulation of the railroad sector, which ended up kind of opening up the sector to competition. It was seeing quite a bit of competition from trucking in particular. The net result, it's a long story, there's a lot of information out there, but the net result was that the industry ended up offering better terms and prices for shippers. And not just that, there was also a greater degree of innovation in terms of shipping services than you'd seen before. So you have new developments in the types of rates that they can design, new developments in the types of cars that they were offering for shipping, and it was really quite, I think, a positive thing all around. I think the last key point I want to make has to do with something that was mentioned just earlier on the panel, and I think it's a really important point, and that's to look at the sort of intersection between competition law and regulation. And here our default as an investigator and enforcer in a competition agency, the default position is always that the competition law is going to remain in place regardless of the regulation. Now there are some limited instances in which a heavily regulated industry can sort of preempt competition law, but those instances are really limited. And in fact, they're limited under the US standard to instances in which the legislator has clearly articulated an objective to limit competition and replace it with something else. And not only that, there needs to be some active supervision by a state agency of that regulatory scheme. That's a really high standard. We've had lots and lots of cases that have challenged various elements of this test. The net result is that very often, most often, these are, the competition law and regulation will sort of exist side by side, and the competition law mandates, need to be satisfied in addition to what the regulations might require. Just a practical case from my own experience on the merger side. I recently worked on this ETE Williams deal, which was a pretty significant $38 billion merger of two natural gas pipeline companies in the U.S. Most of their assets were in the U.S. They had a little bit in Canada, but most of it was U.S. In the U.S., not a surprise, interstate natural gas pipelines are very heavily regulated by our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, our FERC. But the acquisition here had an overlap, a significant overlap. ETE controlled one of the major pipeline networks that served the state of Florida. And Williams had a controlling interest in basically the other pipeline that served the state of Florida. So you can see there's a pretty obvious competitive issue at play. There's also a third pipeline that was being built that Williams had an interest, so the case was actually a lot more complicated than what I'm about to describe. But for purposes of this discussion, I think it's fine just to focus on the head-to-head competition that we were concerned about in that case. Now, the regulation of those pipelines, those FERC tariffs set the terms of service that the pipelines must provide. They also set the maximum rates at which the pipelines can charge for those services. So when you look at that merger, the first question you would have is, well, I can see that these pipelines are serving the same area, but how, after the acquisition, will rates possibly go up? And the answer is the theory that we pursued had to do with looking at the unregulated aspects of those pipeline businesses. And there were two things in particular that I want to point out. The first being that the fact that the tariff rate approved by FERC, approved by the regulator, set the maximum rate that the pipelines could charge. But there was still discounting behavior going on, and the decision to grant a discount was something that FERC simply didn't regulate. So there were instances of head-to-head discounting off the full tariff rate that occurred between the two pipelines. That was unregulated. That was something that we were concerned about the acquisition potentially affecting. The second point would have to do with decisions to expand the pipeline. While the pipelines would need to get FERC approval, FERC authorization in order to go forward with an expansion, the ultimate decision of whether or not to expand was something that was unregulated. And again, we had some competitive concerns about how the acquisition would affect incentives to expand. The last point I'll make on this case, there was that third pipeline I mentioned raised some vertical issues that created an opportunity for a conduct remedy, or at least part of the remedy to have some conduct elements in it. when you're dealing with regulated industries and you're coming up with a remedy, you've got to be really careful that you're imposing obligations that sort of make sense given the regulated environment. So we have to do quite a bit of work to just understand exactly what it would take to fix the vertical problem really did involve understanding the regulation. It doesn't mean that we don't do it, it just means that we do it and we're sensitive to the firm's regulatory obligations and incentives that are created under the regulatory scheme. I think that's it. I'll turn it over, but I'll thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Our next speaker is Russell Pittman, Director of Economic Research, U.S. Department of Justice, and visiting lecturer with the Kyiv School of Economics, and sometimes giving lecture with the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine. Russell will talk us, of course, about natural monopolies and competition issues in natural monopolies, and I hope that we'll heard the answer for the question how to define actual natural monopolies and potentially competitive industries.
I'll see what I can do. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I do appreciate the invitation and the honor to participate in this important annual event. Like Brian, I begin by reminding you that the views expressed are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. Department of Justice or the U.S. government. Not that any of us knows what the views of the U.S. government are today, but that's a different issue. One of the things that strikes, especially a competition authority, looking at regulated industries, is that as we start asking questions, as we start looking at the issues involved, how much superficially all the regulated industries, all the natural monopolies, and I will get back to that term, sort of look alike and sort of raise similar issues. All of these sectors have a network of some kind that has very large fixed costs, usually what economists also call sunk costs, that are arguably a natural monopoly, that in many cases one would not want firms to build duplicative networks. It would be very expensive and wasteful to do that. Not always, but in many cases. And yet in all of these industries over the past few decades, what we have seen, maybe economists and lawyers and policymakers have gotten smarter, but also there have been a lot of technological developments that have made competition possible in many aspects of these industries. And so just to give you some example, in railways, many people would say the track and infrastructure are a natural monopoly, and yet there are many proposals and even examples of countries that have allowed competing train operating companies on this monopoly track. In fact, that's the latest, as I understand it, the current reform legislation in Ukraine would do precisely that. In electricity, the long-distance transmission and local distribution lines are often treated as natural monopolies, and yet, as we've already heard more than once in this session, in many countries there are attempts and some successes in creating competition among generation plants, nuclear and coal and gas and solar and all that, competing with each other to generate electricity into the network. Natural gas pipelines may be a natural monopoly, and yet in many countries we have competing companies doing the exploration and production. In telecoms, what we call in the US at least the last mile, the wires connecting my home or my business to the network, perhaps are a natural monopoly. There's less than we thought, but used to be considered a natural monopoly. And yet some of the original cases in this area involved, for example, long-distance telecommunications, later on internet service, now cable TV provision, the idea that competing companies could provide the content. And finally, there's a move, at least in the UK and Australia, not too many other places yet, to create competition in the water sector, where again the local pipes would be a monopoly, but we would have competing companies extracting water from the ground or doing purification of seawater, all kinds of things to compete to put water into the networks. And what strikes a competition authority or person or economist or lawyer is that all of these different sectors have questions that look the same, and for a while people thought the answers were all the same. For a while, people like my dear friends at the World Bank, I don't think our representatives here today, used to travel around the world and say, oh, it's a natural monopoly, here's what you do. And I think what we've all learned, and the bank and economists and everybody including in all that, is that in these different sectors, even though the questions look the same, the facts on the ground are very different, and therefore the answers may be very different, the answers that will lead to the best outcomes. So, let's assume for the moment these are natural monopolies. What are the right solutions? In particular, is it feasible? Again, many of us initially thought it would always work. Sometimes we're not so sure now. Is it going to be feasible to create actual, workable, beneficial competition in what we might call these upstream parts of the sector? We've learned from painful experience now, just because you break up these sectors and open them up for entry, competition doesn't always work very well. There are many areas where electricity competition has not worked well, and our own state of California in the US is a very good example, where people thought creating competition was going to be a great success, and it turned out to be very difficult, expensive, and really, I would say, a policy failure. Some people would say even if it works, it's not always worth the effort. I heard some British economists explaining that the problems with the water sector in England were that the pipes were all leaking. They were losing, a quarter or a third of the water just from these old leaky pipes. So therefore let's create competition in purifying the water. Well, that struck me as very much a non sequitur, that having competition in creating the pure water was not going to help the leaky network at all. But then a second question, which we've all been struggling with for, again, decades now, if you want to create competition upstream, if you want to have competing train companies on the track, if you want to have competing generation companies generating into the electricity sector, should you allow vertical integration? Should you allow the network provider to be a competitor upstream? There was for a long time a consensus among mainstream economists, especially pro-market economists, no, of course not. You cannot allow the network operator to operate upstream. Why not? Because it will always discriminate in favor of its own subsidiary. On the other hand, one of the things we've learned is, as we've broken up, as we've demonopolized, as we've restructured a lot of these vertically integrated natural monopolies, we've been reminded of what the new institutional economists, as well as the incumbents in these sectors, were telling us all along. Wait a minute, there are some economies of vertical integration. There are some reasons why you might want the company that owns the tracks to run trains on them. There might be economies of investment, of scheduling. There might be economies of vertical integration that you will lose if you break up the industry. And there's a lot of good economics literature now, sector by sector, on what cost you pay to break up a vertically integrated infrastructure provider. And maybe the cost is worth it if you really succeed in creating competition. But it's no longer acceptable to say, as we economists really used to say, I would say in the 90s, oh, those costs can't be so much. I mean, they'll figure it out. These costs really are significant, and so it becomes a real question whether you want to pay those costs or not. So if we look at particular sectors, electricity, natural gas, railways, a competition authority especially has to face different issues. If the country allows the infrastructure operator to be vertically integrated into services, for example, as I understand it, under current provisions, Ukrzaliznytsia will control the complete railway network in Ukraine, and it will be allowed to run trains. So if you allow Ukrzaliznica to control the network and run its own trains, then you have one set of competitive problems. And they're what I mentioned before, they're discrimination. We've seen again and again in countries around the world that if the network provider continues to operate upstream, but is forced to allow competitive access, it will try to disadvantage those independent companies. Again and again, in telecoms and electricity and railways, we see that. Price is one issue, price of access, but also terms of service. It makes a lot of difference in railways and electricity if you let me run my trains or generate my electricity at 9 in the morning as opposed to 4 in the morning. And yet the infrastructure operator may have a lot of discretion vis-a-vis a regulator and a competition authority in not only the price of service, price of access, but also the terms of access. In many cases, and again, railways are the one I know best, what regulators and policymakers have tried to do is insist on separate accounts. So, for example, in Germany, Deutsche Bahn is a single company, but the accounts are kept separately and there are separate subsidiaries for freight train operation, passenger train operation, and running the infrastructure. Same way in Italy. What that has done is it has opened up the network for competing train operating companies, and it has given a whole lot of business to the competition authorities because the infrastructure operator keeps figuring out ways to discriminate against the independent train companies. And so even in these countries when competition has been introduced and when independent train operating companies have been allowed on the track, the incumbent has succeeded in maintaining a very high market share in the operations because of its control of the infrastructure. On the other hand, if you break up the company and allow, for example, and forbid, for example, Ukrzaliznica to run trains, or forbid Ukrainian electricity network operator to generate electricity, you lose some vertical economies, you lose some economies of vertical integration and increase what we economists like to call transactions costs. And you also still have that monopolist there, it's just the monopolist of the network. And so you haven't changed things a whole lot from what you had before. You have a monopoly in many cases, network operator, you have to figure out how to regulate that and get it the right incentives. One of the most common issues we've seen in either case, and this was discussed yesterday in the context of Ukraine, is that the network operator may try to make extra profits by putting conditions on customers. Someone yesterday mentioned the fact that in one part of Ukraine, the electricity company was charging a big price for interconnection. So it's what it could charge for power was regulated, but somehow it was getting around this by charging an interconnection fee. What we've seen in several other countries is the electricity company is regulated at what price it can charge you, but it charges you extra for a meter. And by the way, our meter costs 3 times as much as what you could buy at the local shop, but you have to use ours. It's been big business again for the competition authorities to try to figure out ways, to try to attack ways that these companies have used to evade regulation. And again, as I mentioned when we were discussing yesterday, in the US, the regulator handles most of this, but in many countries, there is not a regulator, or in some sectors, like transport so far in Ukraine, or in some situations, the regulator is not strong enough. In all those situations, the anti-monopoly authority has become sort of a backdoor or default regulator trying to protect customers. It would rather not be dealing with the electricity company on a day-to-day basis, but if there's nobody else to do it, often the anti-monopoly authority is who does it. I want to mention a couple of interesting cases we've had in the US as examples of, I think, interesting applications of competition law to regulated sectors. When we have a regulated sector, often the analytical issue is what is keeping competition from existing in this sector? As we economists would say, what is the binding constraint that's keeping companies from other countries or companies that want to vertically integrate? What is keeping competition from breaking out in this sector? And this frequently has to do with barriers to entry into the market. Sometimes they are imposed by the regulator, as has been mentioned earlier. Sometimes they are successfully imposed by the incumbents. And I want to mention two recent cases we've had in the US. A couple of years ago, we had a merger proposal from two of our biggest airlines. If I recall right, by then there were only 4 big major, what we call legacy airlines. Brian can help me if I'm remembering them right. US Air, Delta, United, and American. So we were down to 4. The number had been higher, it kept getting smaller, we kept having bankruptcy, we kept having mergers. And a few years ago, US Air and American wanted to merge. They had the advantage that American was coming out of bankruptcy, so they could say, oh, we're in bankruptcy, we really need a partner. DOJ and the courts, you've got to go easy on us because otherwise we won't be able to compete. But it was going to really concentrate a lot of markets in the US. It was going to really make a lot of airline origin-destination pairs go from 3 carriers to 2 or even 2 carriers to 1. So DOJ decided to challenge. This was a case where in most regulated industries, we actually have jurisdiction to challenge mergers. Not all of them, it depends on the sector. But we challenged the merger. We were headed to court, we were all set to go. When we're headed to court in a merger, and this is probably how Brian spends half his time when we're headed to court on a merger, we were also talking about remedies with the companies. The companies were saying, okay, we think your challenge is completely wrong, but let's see if we can fix this. And they were making offers. And one of the offers that these companies offered to us, and we ended up accepting, much to the surprise of many observers, these 2 airlines controlled a lot of what are called slots in particular airports. Several of our most busy airports are filled to capacity with the number of takeoffs and landings that can be allowed. They just can't, they don't have the capacity to get any more. And a slot is permission to bring one airline in at one particular time every day. And these particular airports, New York, Chicago, DC National are 3 that are examples, are what's called slot constrained. There was an absolute limit on how many slots could be given to a new entrant, for example, or a low-cost airline. And there were none available. And so US Air and American offered to make some of their slots available on the open market to the low-cost airlines if DOJ would allow the merger. And my boss, I work for the Department of Justice, one person is the prosecutor and decides whether to accept the deal or not. The judge has to look at it, but basically one person decides. My boss decided that increasing the possibility of having low-cost carriers service these several airports would be so beneficial at those airports that it would outweigh what we believed was a significant loss of competition overall. And he took the deal. And it was quite surprising. Many people were surprised by this, but we accepted this deal because it allowed entry into many markets, and my boss decided this would spur more competition, even though in other markets competition was going to be harmed. And we dropped the suit. We didn't go to court. The second case, I didn't work on the first case. The second case I worked on, the 2 companies in New York City that provide these double-decker hop-on, hop-off tour bus services merged. They merged and they raised prices. Now, this was a small merger, and DOJ probably would not have gotten involved. They didn't have to tell us in advance like a big merger. But New York City and New York State governments tried to undo the merger, and they failed. So they called DOJ and said, hey guys, could you help us? So we looked into it. It looked like a pretty straightforward deal. Yeah, they merged and they raised prices. So we started preparing to challenge, and we ended up filing a court challenge. Now the question is, why would that merger create market power? I mean, how hard is it to buy 5 double-decker buses and start running them around New York City every 15 minutes? That's all you really need. Well, the answer turned out to be that New York City has very strict regulations. Okay, very strict regulations on where you can stop those buses. If you run a hop-on, hop-off tour bus system, you are only allowed to stop and discharge and pick up passengers at a particular place. And all the good ones were taken. This was like entry slots in Chicago. The two incumbents had all the slots, all the spots within a block or two of the Empire State Building. So an entrant could come in, but it was going to have to stop 4 blocks away and say, oh yeah, there it is over there. You know, it's just a little walk, don't worry. And it turned out no one was willing, the tourists weren't willing to do that. And so what we got was a settlement from the companies. They gave up half of their bus stops. And new entrants into the market were permitted to get those bus stops, and that removed what we thought was the only real significant barrier to entry by others. And so we didn't try to break up the merger. We just tried to make it possible for other people to enter the market. Well, let me close. I just want to raise a couple of broader issues for regulators and competition authorities. First of all, I want to emphasize a point you've heard already today. In many situations, the most important problem facing an infrastructure sector, especially in a country like Ukraine where it's been government owned forever, is the need for investment into the system. The tracks for Ukrzaliznytsia, the electricity the electricity transmission and distribution systems, these are old and worn out. The government has neglected them for decades. The policy implication of this is A, it's very hard to create competition if you can't get electricity that's generated in one place to another. And B, if you create competition, that's probably not going to do very much for getting investment into the system. So for me, it's very important for policymakers, yes, to create competition where they can, but also to look for ways to attract private investment into the system. And in railways, what that has meant is figuring out ways to give long-term control over sections of the track to private companies who have invested in the system. And I've argued you can find my articles in Vox Ukraine, I've argued that if it were possible, Deutsche Bahn and PKP and maybe Burlington Northern would be quite happy to spend millions and millions of dollars upgrading the Ukrainian railway tracks if they were given, say, a 30-year control over the system. Well, the other thing that Maria's been waiting for me to mention is that in many cases, natural monopolies are not monopolies at all. That in railways, many shippers can use trucks or water. My son would never think about paying a monopoly price for a wire carrying telephone messages into his home. He would never think about using anything except his cell phone. Those may be natural monopolies, but they may have no monopoly power. And so that is an important issue for policymakers and competition authorities to realize. I want to mention electricity as my last point, since we've talked about electricity, and I want to give people a chance to respond to this, certainly, but electricity is a sector where it's been very difficult to create competition. And there's become a consensus, even among people who really want competition, that if you don't have really good sources of cheap natural gas, it's very hard to create competition in electricity. Nuclear plants and coal plants are not flexible. They don't turn on and off in response to price signals. It's very hard to create effective competition. Well, whatever Ukraine has with natural gas, it's not plenty of cheap supplies. It's not much of very expensive and politically difficult supplies. So I would argue that in electricity, maybe in railways and others, I love competition, but there are other priorities that maybe regulators and policymakers and even competition authorities should address that would take the place of trying to create competitive markets when they're going to be very hard to create and maybe not going to work very well. Sorry I took so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such interesting discussion. Виталий Григоровский, президент Ассоциации операторов распределительных
CEO is from the Association of Distribution Network Operators. There's very little time left before lunch, so I would really request you to be very brief. Greetings from the Distribution Network Operators Association. We heard now from public authorities, from experts on principles and methodology of regulation. Now let me say a few words in behalf of those who are natural monopolies with regard to regulation and its impact on, well, distribution networks in this case, and sustainable operation of the unified grid of Ukraine. Now, a couple of words on the physical assets in this area. Let me draw your attention to the fact that 90% of electricity generated in Ukraine is distributed to consumers through low voltage distribution networks. Over half of such networks are in bad repair, and the wear and tear of this infrastructure is 60 years plus, 60% plus. Currently, to build a kilometer of low voltage network, you have to invest at least 1 million hryvnias. Now to the structure of the tariff. That's where we see the first element of discrimination against natural monopolies. As you can see from this chart on the slide, operators' costs are covered only at the rate of 6 to 8%, whereas in Europe you have about 30% coverage, and in some cases, say in New York City, the share of distribution company is almost 60%. As a means to resolve this negative situation, we propose to introduce an incentive pricing, the so-called RAP tariff. All experts concur that it is time it be introduced. Most of the dispute is ROI. International experience shows that in some nations you can have unified tariffs or rates, like in the UK, Austria, and in other countries you have some differentiation, such as in Germany, Switzerland. In Ukraine, what is proposed is to introduce either a unified rate, and last year the Ministry of Economic Development approved a relevant resolution. There is opposition who says that there should be differentiated rate, 90% for new capital and 5% for the so-called old capital. We are in a situation when a number of distribution companies are to go private. It's an open secret probably that Ukraine is a high-risk country. Potential investors, therefore, do not think it serious for the government to provide 5% rate of return. I remember the previous wave of regional distribution companies when mid-size investors managed to prevail at having 17.5% rate established. So our association believes that there should exist this unified rate of return, and RAP regulation may give a good signal to investors to come and invest in distribution networks. In spite of declarations to this effect, no decision has so far been made, and it's anyone's guess whether it ever be adopted. Drop regulation, however, isn't the only factor that influences electricity distribution. There's another aspect, and that is two-step tariff, which we believe is another discriminatory aspect in respect of the natural monopolies. I'll try to clarify. In accordance with the law on the energy market in Ukraine and in accordance with the third package, the electricity distribution has to be unbundled. Low voltage infrastructure and distribution companies will be prohibited from end user supply or to have any affiliation with companies in this business. We believe, and we may refer to the international experience, that distribution network operators provide two types of services to consumers. Distribution proper, but this is variable and depends on the energy consumed. Second is connected capacity for a consumer to have 24/7 opportunity to use the connected capacity. Operators have to carry some cost, the cost of maintaining the infrastructure, and these costs are not really in any way related to the volume of consumption. This two-step tariff, unlike the rest of the civilized world, does not exist. Look at Pennsylvania Power and Light bill. You have the separate line for connected capacity.
The third point that I'd like to make. The same draft law on the electric energy market in Ukraine to some extent destroys the principle of functioning of natural monopolies. I mean the owners of so-called closed electric networks, which according to the new law may engage in distribution of electric power, but they will not be licensees anymore. That's absolutely unbelievable situation in spite of many requests from actually our association. The legislators did not pay attention, just ignored our comments. This is without speaking about such things like anti-competition decisions made by the regulators, by which different consumers are split into different categories of consumption. We protested against that, but that process was ignored too. Hence, we believe that at least the fact that there are already discussions around the improvement of the state regulation and compliance with principles of non-discrimination within the activities of natural monopolies of power supply is a positive message, but so far nothing is moving forward. We all understand that the energy market is one of the foundations of the state security, and any unthoughtful actions in this area are not admissible at all. On the other hand, we understand that the current physical conditions of low voltage distribution networks in Ukraine is so bad that if the state, regulators or legislators do not make necessary decisions, we'll have a collapse in a dozen of years. We'll just have a man-made disaster. Can you imagine outage in a city where you have 1 million inhabitants? So we hope that will not happen. And we hope that the compromise between the three major players, which is state, business, and consumers, so this compromise will be found. And the unified power supply system operation will be supported on the basis of cooperation, mutual understanding between the regulator and the anti-monopoly committee, etc. Thank you very much. My thanks to all the speakers. I really apologize for the delay, and since we have no time, let's postpone the questions for the lunch time, or maybe next time. Okay, thank you all and enjoy your lunch.